Straconsult, who has a rich experience in the public sector management and political economy research. And we have Professor Rajen Narsinghen, who is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Mauritius. He is also an academic coordinator for LLM on human rights at the University of Pretoria. Now, before we go on, just to mention that participants can use the Q&A feature on their Zoom to type in their questions, and I will try to read them during our Q&A session at the end of the discussion. So now let us talk about the declining quality of governance and democracy in Mauritius. Over to you, Mr. Darga.
Well, thank you, Suhaylah. Good afternoon to everybody, to all the participants. Thank you, Afrobarometer, for organizing and hosting this webinar. Well, it is a moment where at the same time I'm sad to talk about the situation that has been prevailing in Mauritius for the past 10 years but I'm happy to share with my colleagues and friends across the continent the experience which basically says that you can never take for granted, even when you reach a state where you have good governance and you have good democratic practice, you can never take for granted that it is a given. This has been the case in Mauritius, as Suhaylah said. We Mauritians have been proud for decades since our independence in 1968 to have a stable democracy, a performing democracy, a democracy that has allowed for alternance. Government has changed many times in Mauritius. People of Mauritius, when they so decided in elections, change their government if they are not happy with the government of the day. We have had good governance, which has given a very good level of human development, of social development, and of economic development. Unfortunately, for the past, let's say 10 years, since 2010, we have seen a deterioration in the quality of the democracy in Mauritius and in the quality of good governance. And I'll point you to specific indicators, to specific factors that illustrate the point that I've just made. The survey that we did in last year, in 2020, for Afrobarometer, over a whole range of indicators of questions asked to respondents concerning the quality of democracy, the quality of the last elections that we had in December 2019, of trust in institutions, of corruption, etc. All the results show a negative trend of perception by the people of Mauritius. Now, this negative trend of perception is actually very much underlined by facts. What are the facts? One, we have been actually for the last 2 decades debating about what we consider to be an unfair electoral system. Our electoral system is what is called the first past the post, i.e. you have constituencies, candidates under the flag of a party run for election, and it's the first who gets the most vote who gets elected. Now, the unfairness of that system is such that, I'll give you just a few figures, that the winning party gets an exaggerated number of seats in parliament compared to the losing party. For example, the government that we have now, the ruling party that we have now in government, got only 37.6% of votes from the Mauritian people, yet they have 60% of the seats in parliament. The losing party got 33% of votes and have only 37% of the seats. So there's an imbalance between the two parties based on the number of votes that they get. I'll take another example. In 1995, the ruling party, the winning party, got 65% of the votes, but got 100% of the seats, whereas the other party who got 20% of votes got 0 seats. So there's been debate for quite a long time that this system is unfair and doesn't allow for proper representation of the will of the electorate. Unfortunately, the problem has not been resolved to date, basically because all parties at one time or another have paid lip service to reforming the electoral system, but when they get in power, they just don't want to change the system. So we're still living with a system which is unfair. Secondly, corruption. Well, corruption is there in most countries, we know that. And we've had corruption in Mauritius for a long time. However, we didn't have a high prevalence of corruption. Petty corruption was there, but petty corruption now has been greatly reduced. So I'm focusing more on high-level corruption. And in the last 10 years, we've seen extremely shocking cases of high-level corruption. I think that I'll take as example what was the most shocking case, namely just after 2014 elections, the then government went to the house of the former prime minister, searched his house, took out vaults, opened the vaults, and in the vaults, there were notes equivalent to about 6.5 million US dollars, partly in foreign currency and partly in local currency, the Mauritian rupee. Viciously, the then government put that whole scene on TV. So every single Mauritian could see the opening of the vault and could see the notes flowing out of the vault. I think this has been a moment where Mauritians who have always known there is corruption was fundamentally, tremendously shocked that they could now see that a former prime minister was actually holding that much money, which apparently, allegedly, is ill-gotten. The prime minister, this is a case in court up to now, it has not been resolved. The prime minister claimed that this was donation to his party. But in any case, the perception then made that idea that corruption, high-level corruption is very much prevalent in the country, made it live. And subsequently, there's been a number of cases. I won't go into the details of all these cases. Up to now, last year, under the pandemic situation, there was procurement of a number of items for sanitary purposes, and it was discovered, it became public, that there was very, very high-level corruption to an extent which is absolutely shocking, that the prices paid for certain items were 67 times the normal price that would be paid for those items. So corruption has actually hit the mind of Mauritians to the point that, to the point of despair, I would say. The third element is what I would call the curbing of Parliament's capacity to perform fully its role. We unfortunately have had for the last decade a weaker Parliament. By weaker Parliament, I mean we've got weaker parliamentarians on both sides, but we've got also a weaker opposition not being able to play and not capable to play fully its role in challenging government, in questioning government, in bringing out more transparency and getting information for the purpose of general public. But also, since the last elections, there's been regularly cases where the speaker is perceived to have abused his power and sanctioned the opposition for asking questions, basically putting members of parliament out, right? Saying you get out of parliament, therefore being unable to ask their questions. But also on the part of the opposition, the feeling is that there's been an abuse of walkout. So either the member of parliament from the opposition walks out, or is thrown out of parliament for that sitting by the speaker. So there's been a curbing of parliament's capacity to perform fully its role. Now, more importantly, since I think the last 2 or 3 years, every sitting of parliament is on TV now. You can follow live what happens in parliament. And unfortunately, parliament and parliamentarians on both sides have indulged into shouting competition, sometimes with swear words. So that has also brought down the esteem and the respect of the population towards parliament and the parliamentarians. The next point I would put to you in terms of the decline is the appointment of low competence cronies at the head of key institutions, both regulatory and implementing institutions, and with the result that this has led to poor performance of these institutions. The result of the poor performance of these institutions has either hampered economic development, delivery of service, but also has created situations where Mauritius has earned a bad name on the international front, and as you know, has been in certain cases blacklisted because the regulatory institution didn't perform its job properly. We have also noted an increasing automatic control of certain institutions, including the University of Mauritius. You know, to organize a conference, the university cannot make that decision. The board, the council, has to refer to Prime Minister's office to get the authority to organize a conference. And Professor Narsinghen, being from the university himself, has been a victim to certain ways of doing things by government to try to shut him up. Adding to that, we have recently seen an attempt to install regulatory measures basically on the information and communication technology, i.e. all the social media, where the regulatory body, which is called ICTA, which is Information and Communication Technology Regulatory Authority, came out with a paper supposedly for consultation, but in fact they were trying to take the pulse of the public, where they would use technical means to control completely the freedom of speech on social media. But more than controlling the freedom of speech, obviously they said that this was to protect the Mauritian citizen from abuse, right? But more than that, it would also have allowed them to intrude into the privacy and get technical information on each citizen connecting to social media. They seem to be backpedaling on that now because there's been a major outcry about that. Let me add 2 more points and end on that. One is the serious loss of trust in the mainstream political class. One, due to the fact that this political class has remained the realm of a dynasty of 2 families. If you look up the name of the prime ministers since independence, 1968, you will basically find 2 names, right? So it's one family, and then government changes, it's another family, and then government change, the family of before comes into government. So it's been the realm of 2 families, and Mauritians are fed up with that. The more so is that the head of these families, and in the present case is the son of a former prime minister who is now prime minister, right? I mean the son. They have all at one time or another been involved into cases that are unethical, into cases that are perceived as corruption. So this political class has lost not only the 2 families, but the whole political class has lost trust from the Mauritian citizens. Now, the blow came in December 2019, indicating that decline, that slow but clear erosion of good governance and democracy in Mauritius. In December 2019, there were general elections. We have had general elections almost every 5 years in Mauritius since 1968. And all general elections, the process, the management of the elections have been very clearly laid and generally well managed, and the process very well followed, which process allowed for proper registration of voters, allowed also for all the candidates and their agents to monitor each and every part of the process, therefore ensuring that everybody came out of the election, losers or winners, satisfied that it was free and fair. In December 2019, the general elections unfortunately departed from that. A number of incidents, a number of cases, and there are now many cases of challenge in court, right? And through the cases in court, we are learning new things. For example, we are learning that part of the process, which was not revealed and where candidates were not informed, part of the process was the compilation of results by computers in a computer room. And it came out in a court case now that the candidate who is challenging the results could not have access to the computer room, therefore could not monitor one part of the process. There's been a number of cases where voters were struck off the voters register. So the general perception for the 2019 election is that this 2019 election was not run as free and fair as it was before. And as I said, I think there are about 8 or 10 cases of challenge in court now to be heard. So for all these reasons, there is more and more a strong feeling, backed by the facts that I've enumerated and other facts, that there is a decline in the quality of governance. There is a decline in terms of the quality of the political class. There is a decline in terms of the practice of democracy. There is a tendency towards autocratic behavior from the top, from the Prime Minister and his team. And since 2 years now, Mauritians, the civil society has started coming out on the streets in substantial big numbers sometimes to show their disappointment and to protest against the state of things. We now have a situation, therefore, where we have a government which is in power with only 37% of votes, therefore a minority of Mauritians supported that government to be in power, and a general feeling of despondency that the quality that we have enjoyed for decades in terms of good governance and democracy is declining. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Darga. I will hand over to Professor Narsinghen for his comments. Professor Narsinghen, could you unmute yourself, please?
Okay, so thank you, Mrs. Suhaylah. And also I will seize this opportunity to commend both Afrobarometer and also Straconsult and all those who have facilitated this conversation on democracy. Now, I think that Mr. Darga has covered quite extensively all the sort of topical issues, recent issues which have taken in place in Mauritius. Mrs. Suhaylah is right to point out that for a very long time, you see, after independence, since 1725, you have to know the history of Mauritius, with the French here and the British, there has been a sort of incessant fight for democracy, consolidation of democracy. And after independence, it was a tough battle led by the politicians, Sir Sagar Ramgulam, and later Mr. Gaetan Duval and others joined. And of course, time and again, we should not try to conceal this. There have been breaches of democracy. But I would say, in a way, it could be considered as sporadic. And overall, Mauritius was considered as on the African continent. And this is also, I think, very sad, always to compare Mauritius with other African countries. And we know that some African countries, I won't mention names, they are progressing, and in relative terms, for the last 8 or 9 years, maybe better than Mauritius. So also during the prime ministership of late Sir Anirudh Jagannath, he was a tough prime minister. There have been breaches of democracy. Freedom of expression has been in danger, has been threatened. He was very tough, but overall, in relative terms, I would consider, yes, Mauritius was still a good student in terms of upholding democracy. Now, during the term of office of Mr. Navin Ramgulam, here also, I won't say everything was perfect. There have been some breaches, even during the term of office of Mr. Paul Béranger. And so in relative terms, Mauritius has been doing very well, very well. But unfortunately, I consider that where I have a slight sort of nuance with Mr. Darga. I think, as I mentioned, all these prime ministers, they have been doing quite good or good on the economic plane. They have been doing well, or at times very well, and there have been some breaches regarding democracy. But I think the turning point has been 2014 with this actual government. The problem is with this actual government, for the first time, I think Mr. Darga mentioned about the case of the ex-prime minister being arrested. You see, for the first time, after general election, somebody is being arrested. And as Mr. Darga pointed out, on alleged corruption and proceeds of money coming from the corruption. But the way the arrest was done, for the first time, I wrote an article some time back to say for the first time, we are trying to Africanize, in a way, Mauritian politics. Because Mauritian politics, Mauritius has been known to be a very stable democracy. Otherwise, when Mr. Navin Ramgulam came to power, he could have arrested late Mr. Anirudh Jagannath, Sir Anirudh Jagannath, with the Sun Trust, a colossal building in the midst of politics. Well, after 11 cases, 11 charges were leveled against Mr. Navin Ramgulam, and the police force, and all the institutions, the ICAC, were in the hands, are still in the hands of the same government, and not a single case has been proved. Well, the case, I think there are some remnants of the case still on. We'll wait and see what will happen. Now, the turning point you will see, Mr. Darga has mentioned. 2014, this government, same government, won, and I think there are multi different factors which could explain why this actual government won in 2004. Good for government, good for democracy. The elections in 2014 were more or less free and fair, except there has been some abuse of the MBCT. But notwithstanding that, the opposition, at that time spearheaded by Mr. Sir Anirudh Jagannath, won the election. Good for democracy. There has been a change, I think, after 9 years of governance from the Labour Party and the PNS. But from there on, in power, this government, as I mentioned, they have been using as an instrument the ICAC the body which is responsible to track corruption. They have been using the police force for the first time to track political opponents. This is what happened in 2014, 2009. And I think Mr. Darga trying to drive a very important point. He talked about allegations for the first time. I think in 1991 or in the 1990s, there were some allegations, again, regarding rigging of elections. But this was, quickly resolved. The opposition at that point in time stopped with these allegations. But unfortunately, with the election of 2019, Mr. Darga has already spoken about the use of a computer room. And you know how in Latin America and in some other parts of Africa and in Asia, how the IT system have been used to rig election. I'm not saying that there has been rigging of election. A number of cases are being dealt with by our Supreme Court. Let us wait and see. Now, coming to electoral bribery, there has been a case, the famous case of Ashok Jagannath against Rengadu, and both the Supreme Court and the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council had an opportunity to give a sort of landmark judgments in this case. Now, when you compare what happened in the case of Ashok Jagannath compared to what happened in 2019, in many constituencies, you will see there has been rampant sort of abuse of money. Money politics has been on, and we're going to wait here. Either our Supreme Court or the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council will have to pronounce itself on that. So, and one further point, you see, after independence, we have put in place two important commissions provided by the Constitution, not only by the law, because when it comes to the organization of elections, we've got the Constitution, namely section 38, 39, up to 44, regarding the organization of elections and registration of voters. Now, for the first time after the election, the Electoral Commissioner, which is another constitutional post, came to confess and admit that first time on radio, just after 1 week of the election, he confessed that more than 6,000 names have been deleted. 2 weeks afterwards, he came to make a sort of admission that around 16,000 names or 17,000 names have been deleted. Independent experts from the civil society and experts in IT, using two constituencies as a yardstick, they have considered 40,000 names have been deleted on the electoral rolls. So you can imagine a government which won by 23,000 in terms of votes, national suffrage. Now, if it is true, I'm not saying it is true, if it is true, then you can imagine how a government is 37% of the vote nationally. If you try to subtract, you deduct the rigging, deletion of names, computer room, you can imagine what is the sort of support this government is enjoying or enjoyed when the elections were over. So this is about the electoral system. Mr. Darga mentioned about the best loser system, about the census of 1972 being used. All these issues have to be rectified in a new future constitution of Mauritius. I will take Parliament briefly. You see, once somebody has been elected, the Constitution provides, under Section 34, that this is a right, a constitutional right to be an MP. Now, Section 48 of our Constitution provides that the Parliament, the temple of democracy, can make regulations known as standing orders of the National Assembly. Now, these, I'm sorry, these standing orders, they cannot supersede provisions of the Constitution. They cannot supersede provisions of other legislations. Now, if you look at the statistics in UK, because we have borrowed the system the system of speaker from the United Kingdom, you will see over 30 years, on average, MPs, when they have been expelled, they have been named in Parliament. That is, they have been suspended, and then a motion from the head of the executive. They are going to be suspended for 3 sittings, 2 sittings, on average 3 sittings. Here in Mauritius, there is that dangerous tendency to suspend members of Parliament sine die, that is, almost indefinitely. So this is what is happening in our Parliament. And the post of Speaker, it seems that after Sir Aril Al-Badji, one of the best flamboyant speaker, with his wit, with his sense of humor, neutrality, and independence. Unfortunately, these are gone days. With the speaker in 2014, you can imagine somebody freshly beaten up in the election who happened to become a speaker, another new speaker who is a staunch supporter of the political party. And as you know, in the UK, once a speaker has been elected, he ceases to be a partisan politician. Unfortunately, this is on in Mauritius. Now, if we leave Parliament, we come to the judiciary. Fortunately, in a way, the judiciary is still, I hope that it will continue. In relative terms, the judiciary is independent because fortunately, we have in our constitution, we have the Judicial and Legal Services Commission. And out of 4 members of the Judicial and Legal Services Commission, you will see we've got 3 members who are very independent: the Chief Justice, the Senior Penal Judge, and another judge, except the President of the PSC, Public Service Commission, who some people may say that he is not very independent. So fortunately, in a way, the judiciary is independent. But I cannot put my hands in fire for everybody, but in relative terms, yes. And recently, we had a judgment 2 weeks ago regarding an interpretation of one section of the ICTA. This is a legislation regarding the use of internet, social media, and telecommunication. So we had a landmark judgment again, thanks to 2 judges, whereby you see in Mauritius now, before it was like this, and it has been beefed up, consolidated, where even if you annoy somebody, and if you're likely, before it was just annoying, now with the new legislation, and I was expelled from one institution, the Law Reform Commission, because 3 barristers and myself as an academic, we were opposing changes being brought to the legislation. So you can imagine annoying somebody or likely to annoy somebody under section 46, subsection H of the legislation, you can be taken to task. And now this new government, again, is trying to amend the ICTA to do what is known as pre-censorship. And you know, in Europe, the Human Rights Court in Europe, in Strasbourg, in many parts of the world, this sort of pre-censorship cannot exist. So they have been circulating a consulting paper, a paper for consultation. And fortunately, there has been a big hue and cry, a lot of protests, more for the first time ever in our young democracy, more than 2,000 people have submitted their views on that sort of law, which was about to, again, torpedo our democracy. So this is about freedom of expression. Now, the IB.
Professor Narsinghen, sorry to interrupt you. We have only a few minutes for your slot. If you could conclude quickly, please. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to mention about radio and television. You know, the sort of abuse, gross abuse from the NBCTV, in spite of the fact that the legislation provides for neutrality of the NBCTV. For the radio, you will see there has been a lot of abuse coming from the regulatory body. So in a way, even our regulatory bodies, which are supposed to be independent, are not being independent. There was an attempt also to clamp down on the Director of Public Prosecution. And here, if you read what Professor Desmith, the founding father of our constitution, mentioned, why we have a sort of post of DPP, we're supposed to be extremely, very neutral, independent and impartial. Unfortunately, with our attempt, And thanks to the PMSD, you will see the political party which left government. Fortunately, this has been left intact. Freedom of expression, the press, during the COVID. Now let me come to the COVID. You will see during the COVID, there has been a lot of laws which have been amended in order to even breach democracy. Regarding the police force, for the first time ever, it's good to listen to that. For the first time ever in Mauritius, a commissioner of police has been given a contract. And you see, under section 71 of the Constitution, purposely, the commissioner of police, this post has been constitutionalized to enable the police to be independent in its day-to-day. Coming to policy matters, yes, the Prime Minister, head of the executive, can intervene, but not on the day-to-day running of the police. And that is why the police, the ICAC, all these institutions, regulatory bodies, Bank of Mauritius, IBA, all these institutions are being used to clamp down on political opponents. And this is why, according to me, you will see why Be Democracy, which is an organization, as you rightly pointed out, Mrs. Suhaylah, Be Democracy, an institution from Sweden, supported by the European Union, the State Department of US, Reporters Sans Frontières, the African Rights Commission in its shadow report, all these independent NGOs or institutions have been blaming for Mauritius. So according to me, the figures speak. The independent institutions speak for themselves. I think Mr. Darga mentioned about my case. I don't want to make any sort of personal use this platform for my personal case, but the State Department of the United States mentioned that for the first time after 53 years, academic freedom, which is one of the main pillars of democracy, has been breached by this government. And the more you talk, this morning itself, before coming on this platform, my wife, who has 2 degrees from UK, has been demoted. And apparently the minister mentioned that this is because the order has come from above. It means it has come from either from the Prime Minister himself or from the advisors of the Prime Minister. So in a way, what they want, that's why Mauritians are scared to talk. So they want to finish me, put me on the street without food, put my wife on the street, and put at stake. And this is what I call, you see, my last word, very last word. In many countries nowadays, it's not like before in sort of dictatorship regime where they're going to kill people, slaughter people physically. But what is happening, and this is very sad, at a time when many Mauritians are paying tribute to the ex-Prime Minister, Sani Hujagna, did quite a number of things correctly, number of things, possibly it's not the time for me to talk about it. At a time when we are expressing our condolences to the family, some people in this country, in some position of authority, they are doing what is known as structural killing. Because when you deprive somebody from his job, you demote somebody, you'd want to sack somebody without justification, you are killing people. And when you kill, one of these days, you have to expect retaliation, unfortunately.
Thank you, Professor Narsinghen, for these very interesting insights. We will start the Q&A session with one short questions to the panelists first, and then we will take questions from the attendees. So as you mentioned, Mr. Darga, there has been a cumulative deterioration of good governance factors in Mauritius, in addition to what Professor Narsinghen mentioned about sporadic breaches of democratic principles. But we can see that this perception of declining quality of good governance and democratic principles has particularly been in the spotlight among Mauritians only recently. Mauritians have been taking to the streets and protesting in mass, something Mauritius has not seen in almost 40 years. Can we say that there is an awakening of the Mauritian population today? Maybe we'll start with Mr. Darga. Mr. Darga, you unmute. Could you unmute yourself? We'll give 30 seconds to each panelist, and then we'll take questions to the audience.
Well,
from the audience.
yes, indeed. There is an awakening. You know, the Mauritians, we are at the same time tolerant to a certain degree. We don't like excesses, but at the same time, we are always claiming for better economic situation, better governance, better practice of democracy. So we are very proud of the stand of our country, but we want it to be better. And at the same time, we are tolerant of certain things that, certain wrongdoings that may happen. But recently, in the last 10 years, it's been too much. Professor Narsinghen has underlined some cases. There are a lot of cases that I could underline, but I won't go into that right now. But it's been too much. And therefore, the Mauritian population now is getting fed up and are expressing in very vocal manner on the streets this exasperation. Let me clarify 2 points. One is about what Professor Narsinghen said concerning the arrest of the former Prime Minister Navin Ramgoolam. You know, one of the things that has happened over the decades, I say decades now, that there's been a kind of omerta between the main political parties, i.e. when I'm in government, if I do acts of corruption, if I do certain things that are wrong, then the next government and the next prime minister that will come will not take action against me, right? He will do his job very quietly. And then he will do bad things. And when I come back in government, I won't take action against him. So there's been a kind of omerta, right? We tolerate each other, which is a bad thing because we've tolerated very bad things, until 2011. In 2011, the past Prime Minister, Navin Ramgoolam, and the present Prime Minister were in an alliance in government. And in 2011, the past Prime Minister, Navin Ramgoolam, sacked the present Prime Minister, who was then Minister of Finance, on an allegation of a conflict of interest for a contract that he signed in favor of his brother-in-law. And when he did that, he broke the omerta. The present Prime Minister, the case went to court and he was found not guilty, but the omerta was broken. Therefore, we are now in a situation where successive prime ministers are kind of taking revenge on each other, right? And if you ask any Mauritian now, which says, okay, next election, suppose the former one comes, most people will tell you, oh God, probably will take revenge on the present one. So we are now in that vicious circle, and that vicious circle is not a matter of a feud between two groups, two leaders, but it's spreading in the population in terms of distilling fear and in terms of the rampant, the insidious reduction of the space for expression.
Thank you, Mr. Darga. Professor Narsinghen, some last thoughts in 20 seconds before we take questions from you.
I think it's a good thing. There has been so you see, for a very long time, if you look at civil society, I've always been telling that to my students. For example, even the British people, who are very cold people, they don't express a lot, but when their fundamental rights are being breached, they will stand up, but not with Mauritians. Unfortunately, after Wakashu, and at the same time, when with the pretext of COVID, our fundamental rights, the rights of workers, thanks to a few small political parties and NGOs and civil society. I will mention two names. One is Mr. Bruno Loret, and another one, Resistance Alternative. They have been taking the initiatives and joined by the mainstream political parties, the MMM, and the Labour Party, Navin Ramgoolam and Mr. Béranger, Mr. Xavier Duval. So for the first time, I think we've seen a sort of, I won't say a revival, for the first time, I think, there has been a sort of real awakening of the civil society. But unfortunately, it seems that it is not something which is being sustained. I hope it's not a sort of one-off even. I'm not asking people to go and create chaos, no, but in a democratic society. And this is what Section 1 of the Constitution stipulates clearly. Mauritius shall be a sovereign democratic state. And this is not only what political philosophers, scientists have been saying, like John Stuart Mills, like John Locke, but this is concrete. Our Supreme Court, in a number of cases, string of cases, have proclaimed what is democracy. So I would say, government, this is a time where some people are expressing their, as I mentioned, sympathy to the family of the Prime Minister. It was a golden opportunity for the Prime Minister now to reflect on what his father did. Many good things, a few bad things, or bad things also, but it was a time to rethink about democracy. It was a time to rethink about governance and human rights. But unfortunately, this morning I woke up with a bad surprise. Victimization again. Again and again, it started in 2014, and unfortunately it's continuing. But I'm somebody, not only an academic of human rights and democracy, I'm an activist. So nobody will scare me. They can scare other Mauritians, but not me.
Thank you, Professor Narsinghen. We'll open the floor for the audience for a Q&A session. Please feel free to type in your questions in the chat feature. If you have any questions for Professor Narsinghen or Mr. Darga. We have a quiet audience here.
Well, maybe Ziyanda could put question to prompt or to catalyze the audience to put other questions.
That's a great suggestion, Mr. Darga. I think for those of us who are following this conversation, not necessarily from Mauritius, I would be very interested to know, is there one specific moment that you could possibly point to say, this was the beginning of the decline of quality in Mauritius, or do you think that it's been more of a sort of long-standing or sort of slow process that has evolved over the years? And in that sense, do you then think that an intervention to sort of roll back this backslide, would need to, or do you think that it would come from one sort of big moment, or if you think that this will happen through electoral processes, through the Constitutional Court, or through other political processes?
Before you start, Mr. Darga, sorry, this relates back to a question we got from the audience, which says, what happens now? Is reform possible?
Well, as I said, it's been a slow, insidious process, but amplified and shocking and struck the negative perception in December 2014. December and January 2014 have been major turning points. What happened in I think it was January 2014, basically two things, right, which shocked the mind of Mauritians. One, it was known that the former Prime Minister was having an affair with a lady. That's a private matter. However, two things happened. One, he gave undue favors to that lady to do business in the duty-free section of the airport. That is something that a lot of Mauritians did not appreciate. That was one. The second point was about this vote, where Mauritians could see money flowing out. And the third point was that when he went to election, he came up with his program and he asked for what is called a second republic. And he explained that he wanted to become president, but president with more power than normally our president would have, and for a mandate of 7 years, where now the president has a mandate of, I think, 4 years or 5 years, right? So the perception was, one, a tendency towards autocracy, like him wanting to become a super ruler. Two, a practice of favoritism and corruption that was beyond all proportion that the Mauritians have seen up to now. Now, what will happen? Two things we have to keep in mind. The alternance that we have seen before is less and less giving a situation of change. Unfortunately, as I said, Mauritian population has been losing faith in the mainstream political parties. If you look at the survey for Afrobarometer round 8 for Mauritius, when the question was asked, how much do you trust the ruling party? How much do you trust the opposition parties? Both the ruling party and the opposition party got a low level of trust, meaning people don't trust the mainstream political parties. It is still early days. Many people have been calling, have been wishing for an alternative, right? Something new to come up. We have not seen that yet. We are seeing some, how would I say, some of the water is boiling a bit. There's been these street demonstrations, etc. But that alternative is not yet to be seen. We don't believe that the mainstream political parties are going to really bring reform. Some might be less incompetent or less corrupt or less autocratic than the other one, but there is a certain degree of pessimism for now about a potential rollback of all the negatives that we are seeing. That's the way I see it.
Thank you, Mr. Darga, for replying to this question. We have one last question, maybe for Professor Rajen. How can we instill the right attitudes in our youngsters, given that their role model themselves are engaged in corruption?
Yeah, you see, in a society, in a capitalist society, for the time being, many people, especially the young generation, the young people, we cannot generalize. Huh? You've got young people with a lot of ideals, I can see at the university. But at the same time, what I can say, because there is that mad race from the older generations, many young people are also sort of engaged in that mad race. So, I mean, if you want to bring fundamental changes, it has to be through education. And here, I think the NGOs and the civil society has a very important role to play. Because you see, if we expect changes for the time being, it is very, very difficult. Let us hope, because you see the system that we have in Mauritius, in a parliamentarian regime, the Prime Minister, as pointed out by a number of other constitutionalists, like Pierre Pacté in France, the Prime Minister of UK, the Prime Minister of Mauritius, they are like elected monarchs. And very often they are surrounded by a number of advisors. Now, for the time being, the only hope that you have that the Prime Minister himself is not, let us give him the benefit of doubt. He himself is not victimizing or doing structural killing of people. I've already defined what is a structural killing. But let's hope that some of his ministers and advisors are doing it. Then there is a sort of small window of hope. Otherwise, the other factor which will prevent immediate change is just like in other parts of Africa. The political party in power is not that strong. It has at the most 20% of hardcore support. Then you will see some people with money politics can come and graft itself on that 15, 20%. But the problem is the opposition is divided. The opposition is divided. Like Mr. Darga mentioned, young generation change. For me personally, I don't see it in the coming 10, 15 years because of communalism and casteism. So traditional political parties like the MMM, like the Labour Party, like the PMSD, they have to revamp and reinvent themselves. Along with individual people outside the mainstream political parties have to team up if government does not change, if the actual prime minister does not want to change. But the moment the opposition will be divided, this will be used, unfortunately, by this government to stick to power. And it is very difficult to remove this government with the breaches of democracy taking place for the time.
Thank you, Professor Narsinghen. I think this answered another question that we received as well, which are summarized as what is the role for and the future of political parties in Mauritius? We have a next question, maybe for Mr. Darga. Can we argue that our international diplomacy is impacting on our democracy here in Mauritius? Maybe into a quick 30 seconds, please, so that we can take other questions. Thank you.
Sorry. Well, I would say not really. Not really. Listen, Mauritius has always had a diplomatic relations with a number of favored countries. Those favored countries being India, China, France, UK, much less the US. So these countries have always been our traditional partners, right? And we know, and this is not yesterday, this has been before, namely India, in one way or another, and again, I'll use the same word, insidiously gets a little bit involved in our politics by supporting this or that person to be a prime minister to serve their own geopolitical purpose. But in terms of whether they have an impact on our democracy, no. Definitely, I don't think any of those countries have a negative impact on our democracy. They don't have a positive impact either. They have a neutral impact. This is really a matter for Mauritians and a matter for the citizens of Mauritius. And as Professor Narsinghen just said, and I reiterate, we are in a situation where the play between, because of our electoral system, you see, our electoral system, it's either this one or the other one. If we had a fairer electoral system, it would be easier for new political forces to come up. It's not so easy right now. However, it's been done in the past. It's been done in 1976, where there were two big traditional parties and a very new party, which was 7 years old at that time, came up and almost took power. It can happen, but it will only happen if the citizens, the intelligentsia, and the part of the civil society that really cares for better governance and better democracy, if they mobilize, if they rise, if they go beyond their ego issues, and they are able to coalesce and create a new force in the political scene of Mauritius.
Thank you, Mr. Darga. We will close the session in the next 10 minutes. So if there are any last very quick questions, please post them in the chat box. We have one question addressed to Mr. Darga. Can we say that we have reached a point of no return? Should we be desperate about the present situation?
There is no point of no return in any society, right? Even in the worst cases we can think of in many other countries where there was real dictatorship, there was dictatorship by the army, killing of people, etc. There has never been a point of low return. There may be a period of long suffering. There may be a period of long despair. That may be a period of long despondency. I don't think Mauritius is in a situation of having reached a point of no return. There is no such case. And we should not be desperate about the present situation. However, I always say the following. You know, if we keep focalizing on leaders and we say, well, change will come if leaders change. No, we are the change. So it's up to each one of us to determine whether we want to be part of the change and not be affected by what is called the Tina syndrome. There is no alternative. That's the Tina syndrome. No, if we all want a change, we can make the change happen. It's not about just sitting, complaining, and thinking that, well, let's change that prime minister and put another one and we'll get something better. Not in the situation we are now. We know that. So the change is us, and it's us to make the change happen.
Thank you, Mr. Darga. We'll take one last question, maybe to Professor Narsinghen. Is there a possibility that one of opposition parties, for example, the Labour Party, makes a coalition with the actual ruling party, MSM, for the next general elections? What will eventually happen to our democracy if that actually happens? Professor Narsinghen, maybe in 1 minute. Thank you.
I don't have a crystal ball in front of me to know what may happen. But I am in touch with different political parties, with some ministers in government, and with people in the MMM, in the Labour Party. For the time being, I don't think this will happen. It will not happen because, as I told you, there was 2014 has been a turning point. And many people in the Labour Party, I think, they feel that there has been a lot of injustice. I took the point of Mr. Darga. Yes, there have been, I mentioned that also, some breaches of democracy, tampering with human rights during the reign of Sir Sagar Amoulam, Sir Anibou Jagnat, Mr. Béranger, and Mr. Namin Ramoulam. But we have to compare like with like. The magnitude of corruption for that being during the COVID. Now we are talking about billions of rupees. There were some allegations, some favors extended, as pointed out by Mr. Darga. I don't know if nothing has been proved up to now. But today, these allegations, when you hear, in terms of drug trafficking, Mauritius is becoming a hub for drug trafficking. Who are the sort of mastermind behind? I don't know. In terms of corruption, massive corruption to the tune of billions. Who are doing it? I don't know. Trampling on democracy, attacking the press, L'Express and Top FM, abuse of the Embassy TV. There has been abuse in the past. I'm not saying I'm not saying nothing contrary to what happened in the past. But in the prevailing situation, the only problem, there is a sort of ego among the leaders of the political parties. And also there are some individuals in the opposition, extra-parliamentarian opposition, who can come and help. So you got two options. Either the actual government, especially the prime minister, because he's the leader of his party, he's a sort of owner of his party, he's a real leader, he's the prime minister. There is still some time for him to catch up. I'm sure about it. As Mr. Darga pointed out, we still have hope. Let us hope that some people have been trying to instrumentalize him to do all these breaches against democracy. I always believe in people, but for the time being, I think there will be a sort of a new political figures. Either they will be creating a new political party and then team up with some of the traditional parties. If the government does not change, I think with a coalition of the opposition and some figures from the extra-parliamentary opposition, this government will be wiped out. There is no doubt about it. If the opposition can team up with some figures from outside.
Thank you, Professor Narsinghen. Well, this has been a
If I may add,
oh, okay, over to you, Mr.
If I may,
Darga.
Suhaylah, just add a word.
Sure.
On the question that you raised, I have a different view from Professor Narsinghen. I think it is not unlikely that you find an alliance now between the ruling party and the Labour Party. I think it is not beyond beyond dream or beyond reality that you might find the former prime minister becoming the president of the republic and his party joining government. Now, if that happens, the country will be in a dangerous situation for the next election on ethnic grounds, because you will find two parties in alliance having the same ethnic constituency against two other parties in opposition having a different ethnic constituency. And if that happens, there will be a very high level of corruption, and that may be dangerous. But I will not exclude the possibility that this happens.
Thank you, Mr. Darga. Well, this has been a fascinating and enlightening conversation with you both, Mr. Darga and Professor Narsinghen. We could have spent some more hours talking about it, but we have a restricted time limit. Thank you so much, and thank you to the audience for their questions. Over to you, Ziyanda.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists today for this absolutely fascinating conversation. I just want to remind everybody, I've put it on the chat box, but all of the, large parts of the conversation we've had, there are resources available on the Afrobarometer website, as well as the Straconsult website that summarize all of the insights from today, and particularly use Afrobarometer data from 2014 to 2020. If you go onto the Afrobarometer website, you'll also see a very newly published research report from myself and Suhaylah on the waning quality of democracy in Mauritius. And within the next week, we will also publish a working paper from Mr. Darga on this very issue. So look out for both of those publications. I just want to say thank you again to Mr. Darga, to Suhaylah, and to Prof. Narsinghen, really for facilitating a fascinating conversation today, and for taking really tough and really sort of no holds barred questions from our audience. Thank you to everybody for engaging today. And just a final reminder that a recording of today's discussion will be available on the Afrobarometer social media platforms as well. Thank you all very much. And if that's
Thank you.
Thank you.
we'll be closing
Thank you,
the
thank you, Afrobarometer, Straconsult, and Mrs. Suhaylah and Stuurman.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Same to you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll take leave.
Okay.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Mm.